Hey, I'm honored to have Bob Bradshaw on today. Bob is the all-father of what we take for granted as modern stereo guitar sounds. If you go back into the history of guitar, if you go to stereo guitar rigs, guitar racks, which are really called Bradshaw racks, effect switching, wet, dry, wet, amps into load boxes, even guitar preamps, you'll find Bob there innovating. And this is not to take away from any of the genius of the guitar players themselves. So just so you don't have to type in comments like, well, of course, but
Pulling the fingers.
yeah, but Bob worked with the best of them. And then sometimes you could hear a before and after, like something about the Bradshaw rig. Man, that was the sweet spot when everything sounded amazing. And I mean, it spoke to me, especially in my youth. And then now it's still, I go back and be like, those are the records. Like I listened to Queensryche, Empire, and those were two rigs that you built. And I know that they
Oh
recorded
yeah.
those in the studio and best guitar sounds on a metal album. I think it's like this perfect mix of Pink Floyd and maybe Iron Maiden or something, and it's just like
Yeah.
pride everything, and So I look at you as sort of a mixer in the same way like Bob Clearmountain and Chris Lord-Alge would take what great artists do, and then make it better. So
I know.
I had this question about stereo guitar rigs, really in a live setting.
Hmm.
So when I go back, I was looking at like what's the earliest stuff. The earliest stereo effect I could really think of was the Boss CE1. Uh,
Bingo.
okay, so it was, and I
Absolutely.
wasn't
Yeah.
I wasn't going to gigs and listening to stuff, and I'm going to skip over some of the stuff that people know, or they should go to your website, the Custom Audio Electronics website, which has a great history. And there was a great interview on Tone Talk that you did. And there's a
Yes.
really cool interview that you did with Mike Saldano for the launch of the new XC88 IR, which
Yep.
is an amazing history of what you've done. So I'm going to assume that people are up to date. And if you're not, go watch those because there's a lot of great info there. So you kind of started your rack building, rig building in very early 80s with Buzz Featon.
1980. Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay, right at the top of the 80s. And
Yep.
so before that, were there like kind of no stereo guitar rigs, or were people using CE1s and having stereo guitar rigs live? Did you see that?
Not that I saw. My initial forays into this business was definitely Buzz Featon, and I took his. Uh, Did he have one? No, he had a stock one. I was thinking Paul Rivera did these really cool mods to them back in the day that added some additional features to them and
To a,
buffered them and
to a
stuff
CE1?
to a CE1, yes. And he had a little kit that he put into them, and he had a little overlay, a sticker that went over the all the lettering and stuff, and it which identified his work. And but Buzz, I believe Buzz had a stock one, so I took that thing and I rack mounted it because that's when the rack thing started happening. And if you look at some early pictures, you'll probably see them on my clunky old website that I need to update terribly. It's got a lot of stuff on it, but it's needs help. Anyway, yeah, the picture of that rack that's got an Echoplex mounted in the top of it. It was one of these slant racks. It wasn't even an actual professional studio rack.
It's like a
Um,
DJ rack, what people would have.
yeah, it was actually a home stereo rack that actually had a glass front that
Oh,
I took
geez.
off. Yeah, and I took that all off, and I had a plate made for it to cover the top. So it was kind of like a an old, what you would call a mixer rack, that had a mixer mounted in the top,
Mhm.
and then rack space. Well, in the top, it had cutouts for an Echoplex, a Boss EQ, a Korg tuner, a Dynacomp, and a Electro-Harmonix micro synth, which was important to a few Neil Larson songs that he needed it for back in the day. And anyway, in that rack, I'm rambling here, but in that rack, there was a blue box just below the slanted part that was mysterious looking because it was handmade by me. That was the Boss CE1 rack mounted, and a Boss CE1 was, yeah, you're correct. It was one of the very first stereo things, meaning it created a stereo image by modulating one side and the other side being direct. So
Mhm.
you would combine that acoustically, and it had this beautiful lush stereo sound. So in other words, you kind of got like a vibrato out of one side. So you had to be careful. And in the beginnings of stereo, and if your sound guy turned up the wrong side and didn't have them the same, you're hearing and it sounds out of tune. It's like, this guy's like whacked. And usually it was a relatively slow modulation to create that stereo imaging. And it was crazy. So one side was dry. So and the other side wet. So when what would happen internally in those things is you would unplug the stereo side or whatever, and it actually just combined it at the jack. It just tied the direct sound to the side. There was no mixing involved. It was just a hard, connection, and that created the back to mono, and then you had the dry and the wet going on. There wasn't any real ability other than the depth control, which Paul Rivera added to the chorus side. If you had I believe on the vibrato, you had speed and depth. But on chorus, they were combined, so there wasn't any depth
Yeah,
control for. So
right.
so you only had one mixture of the chorus sound, and Paul added it's very easy to do if you look at the schematic and you knew what you were doing. It was very easy to add another control to give you a variable depth for the chorus side. So that was helpful. So that added a knob to the modification, and I did that as well in mine because I was fortunate to get a hold of a actual Boss schematic of these things, so I could look at it and see what was going on. Added buffering on the front end because those things had a input level control that was 50K. It was a 50K pot that the input jack went directly to. So you plug your guitar directly into a Boss CE1, and it's loads like this, because your passive pickups get loaded down, the highs roll off, and you've got a mess on your hands. So you had to have something coming before it to buffer your signal, and that could be a Boss pedal or something back then, you know, because Boss pedals were active bypass. So when you plug into a Boss pedal automatically buffers your guitar signal, and
So at
we
some
could
point,
go on a
Boss figured
whole.
out, right? So at some point, Boss figured out, they're like, oh, we need to change our buffer.
Yeah,
What
they
happened?
had electronic switching happening to bypass, and subsequently they had electronics. All Boss pedals are always active,
Mhm.
they're active pedals, but they always that means they buffered your guitar signal. So if you could plug any Boss pedal, I would tell people for years, I would say, "Oh, my sound sounds muffly or something." I said, "Well, plug into your tuner first."
Mm.
Because your tuner is going to buffer you don't need a buffer, so to speak. There's been so much confusion about um, the adjective buffer and the noun a buffer.
Mhm.
You have a buffer or you're buffering. Yeah, so it's two different things happening with the same device, so it's kind of weird, and those terms get mixed up, and have always been that way, and to this day it gets weird. So you have a buffer that you would hope to be transparent to your guitar pickups and not impart any tone of its own, you know. Um,
So a
but
quick
sometimes,
aside, if you when you started into the racks, did you have a buffer for the rack stuff?
oh yeah, yeah, had to. Yeah, I had to because early on with the rack stuff, I used active switching. It wasn't relays, which are passive, doing the audio routing and stuff. It was active electronics, and they had to be loaded in a certain way as to not pop when you would switch them on and off. So,
Okay,
so
right.
to eliminate the pops, they had to be loaded. Therefore, you needed a buffer to drive them, so that your guitar signal remained, constant and as unaffected as possible. But
Gotcha.
that runs into a whole nother um, ball of confusion when it comes to um, the transparency and such of your signal path.
And where
So
was that
that so
located? Would you plug into your switcher? That's the first step.
a lot of times it would be that way. Yeah, early on it was like that, and that's the Pete Cornish approach as well. The gentleman who built systems in England,
Mhm.
he liked to uh, he liked to buffer right at the beginning, which makes a lot of sense. You know, buffer your signal, um, and then your instrument, assuming your instruments have passive pickups and stuff.
Mhm.
If you're talking about EMGs and things like that, then they're already buffered. So you
Right.
don't have to worry about any of this stuff.
Mhm.
But you if your high impedance pickups aren't aren't buffered, then you're going to run into all kinds of you run into a hostile environment. I would always say as soon as your signal leaves your guitar, and that means your cable, the length of your cable can alter the sound of your instrument, just like anything else that happens after you leave your guitar and get to your amp's input, you know.
Right.
So we're off on a tangent here, but these things are important to know in the whole scheme of things, So,
Okay, so if I
but
may,
any
like, you have an early version of the racks with a CE1
yes,
situation. If there was a sort of a blueprint that you'd start seeing a pattern in the later era racks, is seems like an analog chorus, whether it's a TC or a Songbird or something, was
yes.
the starting point of the signal chain.
The chorus I would call the stereo split. That was usually, and as we're on the subject of stereo rigs and such, um, I would call the chorus the stereo split. So mono devices like distortions, compressions, equalization usually um, would come before the stereo split, before the signal split into stereo. Then from there, you go through your reverbs and delays and stuff, and sometimes there might be a mono delay, but on one side, the left or the right, and you would have to choose. Okay, well, how do you want to set this thing up? Do you want it on the left or do you want it on the right? And so early on, rigs were always. It seems like to me, at least the ones that I started doing, and the guys that I was working with, they were always stereo. there was always two channels, you
Hmm.
know, and we dealt with it that way. It was later on that I would do multi-amp, or also a variation of the stereo rig is the wet dry wet thing, which I kind of pioneered that kind of approach, with various guys, mainly Mike Landau and later Lukather and Van Halen, everybody that started getting into that. Um, the wet, dry, wet thing, because it kind of gave you the best of both worlds. But you had to deal, and sound guys had to deal with that because it was always an acoustic balance between your dry sound and your wet sound. That wasn't electronically combined. It was separated. And that's what makes it. Unique and sound huge if you're standing in front of a cool wet dry wet rig that is balanced properly. It can sound wonderful. And then you have to decide, okay, in the stereo end of things, is it going to be really wet? Is it going to be totally wet? Or are you going to have some dry in there too, to help balance out the wet and the dry? And oftentimes there would be dry signal in with the stereo wet side of things, along with that dry center image. So the sound guy in a arena situation, a sound guy, he had the ability to bump up the dry if you wanted to make the the guitar fit in the mix better. In an arena, when you're hundreds and hundreds of feet away from the source, there's and you've got an arena that is imparting its sonic attributes to the whole overall signal. Um, at the sound guy's mix position, you know, that can be crazy. So if you've got a way to get some more dry in there, it all often helps with the definition and the,
Well,
intelligibility.
that's kind of a big question, is can the audience even hear that the guitar is in stereo?
Yeah, usually not, and a lot of times those guys would just combine it anyway. They would combine it on the console and pan it where they wanted it. Because half the time the guy's mix position isn't dead center. It's always off to one side or the other. So he's just got to walk the room when he's at sound check and make sure things are balanced properly, and also be mindful of that to the audience, because the guy sitting way over on the left side is not hearing what's happening on the right side, So a lot of this shit, most PAs and a lot of the great mixers, they're mainly mono mixes in arenas. There's not a whole lot of bouncing around. You don't need that. It's fun, and it's always fun on stage, and it gets the player off to hear that kind of thing. But even then, that stuff, you move away from your rig. Now this is, we're talking, I'm an old guy, so I'm talking the way it used to be. you know so you're only as good as the standing there in front of your rig, in that position between the speakers, but now, if you've got in ears, you've got a stereo mix wherever you're moving. So that's another thing, that now stereo rigs are more, maybe prevalent a little bit more now, because you can have it right in your ears the way you want to hear it all the time. So,
Well,
that's a plus.
like as we were talking about your stereo hi-fi rig earlier, and
Yeah.
obviously you care about that, and there's the sound that you want to hear out of that. To me, there's like it comes down to like a texture almost, and that's when I hear an actual Eventide H3000, an actual PCM 70. There's a
Yeah.
texture in the sound that's sort of really hard to recreate in even the most high end new digital thing that can do anything and can give you 30 of them.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
do you find that to be the case? Is there any like longing, or there's like a certain piece of gear where you're like, nothing is can touch this kind of thing?
Well, yeah, because it's like I said before, the signals are combined acoustically, not electronically. When they're combined electronically, um, you're hearing, even if you wear headphones, you know, you're not hearing the left side out of your right ear. It's isolated. So the stereo separation becomes greater. And it really matters what's going on left and right, because you know you're not hearing it that way. So when you stand back and you hear it, and all of these when it's all done electronically, it's it's just different. It's equally valid. It's just different. And that's why we like these older units and stuff, and hearing them through speakers, as opposed to um, full range through, as beautiful as a great hi-fi system is, or your studio monitors, which you've got right behind you there.
Right.
Sounds awesome coming through there,
Yeah.
but it
But
sure
there is
sounds
that
different coming
cool.
through there. Sounds different coming through those things than it does through your cabinet. You
Oh, yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's like I have a hard time reconciling that. You know, I like to hear things through guitar speakers, and hearing stuff, through full range monitors is uh, it can be great, but it's just different.
There's the other approach, which is in line with what you're saying about acoustically making it stereo, which is kind of I think always think of like Mike Campbell, maybe Joe Perry, which is like they've got some little amps and then they have some big amps, and when you hear just this the different attack and transient and a different frequency here and different, it's
Yeah.
not chorusy, but it's stereo and
Oh
it's
yeah, yeah.
enormous.
Which comes down to the multi-amp configuration, or a multi-amp rig, or what I like to call the garage sale look on stage, where you got amps piled up. Joe Perry was big on that.
Yeah.
And Mike Campbell too, for sure. Um, and also then designating whether certain amps are dry and certain amps might have effects, which
Mhm.
would then create a stereo or an image, and hopefully that their positioning on stage was such that um, you got a uh, more of a stereo presentation, so to speak, because sometimes that's another great sound, though, and that was a sound I came to love years later, um, um, whereby you selected and switched between different little combo type amps, which is the way it's going these days, probably more than anything. There's not as many um, um, big heavy duty amps being used, unless you're in a metal band or a band that has people that can set your gear up for you, you
Yeah.
know. But a
Peter,
lot of
and
us
he's got a
these
rack
days,
of
as we get
Marshalls.
older, nobody wants to lug around a fucking 412 Marshall cabinet
Yeah.
or multiple Marshall cabinets and stuff, unless they're on wheels. And even then, it's tastes change, and that's fine. And the same thing's true with modeling and stuff. You carry a little case that's got a modeler, whether it's floor mounted or in a rack form, and you plug into the PA that's already there at the gig. you know, that's the way it's going. And that's probably the way it's going to be. And I really feel for a lot of these young guys that don't really know what good tube amps sound like, you know. or know what a PCM 42 sounds like,
Hmm.
for that matter, or an H3000 or a PCM 70 or any a number of these old pieces that we love so much, that have a unique sound to them. And then they were just trying to get stuff as good as they possibly could back then with the technology that was available at the time. That's why these
So
things were so
speaking of which, let
big.
me let me ask you. Sorry to interrupt, but so
Sure.
these things were technology was coming out like at the rapid pace, and it was
Oh
growing
my God, yeah.
so fast. And you were like, it reminds me of that "I Love Lucy" scene with the chocolates on a conveyor belt, and
Oh yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah. They're picking them off and eating
yeah,
one, and
it's like, oh,
and
there's
it keeps
a
going.
new thing and a new thing and a new
Yeah,
thing.
very
It,
much so.
as it was
Yeah.
happening, did you realize like, wow, these things sound amazing, or was it
Well,
like
here's
another
the
new
thing.
thing? I'll
Yeah,
try the new thing.
yeah. And what was happening was they were trying to jam all those chocolates into one box. So many of these devices that came out became multi effects
Mm-hmm.
and trying to fit a bunch of things into one box, and they end up um, there's only so much processing power you could get out of the devices available back then, and there would be compromises. Not only that, the signal path was fixed. You couldn't really rearrange stuff, which is why I always went for having individual devices, and which is why my rigs got so big a lot of times was, you had an individual device for each thing. Like this was a delay, this was a reverb, this was a chorus, and they all had specific things. And I would qualify each piece as to what its strengths were, and then place them in the signal path accordingly, depending upon what they were doing. Now, that signal path might be stereo, it might be mono, it might be dedicated to certain outputs, which would go to certain amplifiers if you were so inclined to having a multi-amp configuration. Sometimes a combination of all of those things. I've built many rigs, and there's tons of rigs out there that people make that are based on, they'll have a Axe effects along with a couple of amps or something, and the Axe effects might do its thing, and the other amps would do their things as well, and so there's a ton, many ways to do this thing. Yeah,
So there's
but
another. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, it's just there's certain configurations that just work, you
Hmm.
know. And like currently, I build a device called a stereo wet dry wet interface, which is um, a configuration that you can get that kind of does it for you. I mean, you don't need anything but the effects themselves in one of these units to create a signal path that I designed way back when and implemented in many of these guys' rigs that has a certain configuration in which you can use these older effects, and hopefully ones like I just said that are uh, dedicated uh, to a specific task. Like there's a stereo bypass loop to plug in a tri-chorus or something like it, like a Dimension D, which was another chorus device that came out after the CE1 or, the TC one. I mean, and it could be pedals or it can be rack mount units. It doesn't matter. It can be either one. It doesn't matter. This just happens to be in a rack mount format, but so be it. It's
Do you
got to
sell
be
those
there.
through your website?
Yeah, it's more you've got to kind of. I've I don't think I have. I don't think I have it advertised on the website. But if people contact me, I'll send you a one sheet. That tells you all about it. What it does,
Cool.
and yeah, it's got a mixer. So you use your stuff mixed in stereo. It's got a dry path with a level control for your dry output. And then there's a wet output, two knobs, that's all. and various loops in a signal path that you just plug the effects in, and boom, you've got a signal path that is perfect for utilizing these devices. Stereo, you can plug in your mono delays at the end of the line. After the stereo split, you've got a left output and a right output and a dry output. And it's a great way to implement the signal path that was tried and true, man. Tested years ago, you know, that
So that would be
it's
stereo, but there's another approach too, which is I've seen Landau, probably him and Scott Henderson are the two guys I've seen do that the most, which is sort of stereo mono where there's the dry and then a wet, and I think it's probably maybe just effects out of a separate cab. Um,
uh-huh.
and
Yep.
so like with the device you're talking about, you can kind of do the same thing if you just
You can
do.
do the same thing. Yeah, yeah. You can mute the dry sound in the mixer and just have it 100% wet. Yeah, for sure. Easy. Yeah.
It's a little more straightforward than three cabs, a wet, dry, wet
Well,
situation.
yeah, and,
How to
or
deal with
having to
that.
patch all this stuff together with patch cables and not knowing where, and how this thing's all going to work. And you've got switches on the front panel. You don't need a MIDI controller or anything. You can do it right off the front panel. To turn on and off the various things. There's a couple mono loops, then stereo mix loops and inline stereo loop and stuff. So yeah, but that's the thing. It's like if you've got a multi-amp configuration, yeah, there might be a quote unquote wet amp that only outputs, the return of a delay or a reverb or something, and combined with the dry sound of another amp creates a stereo effect, and that's where you get your stereo from. So all
Okay.
kinds of ways to skin this cat.
Uh, do you, if you were putting together, if some young person comes out, big hit song, whatever that means these days, and
Right.
it's like, I want to rig, would you try and set them up with John Mayer is a good example. Like he comes to you, he's like, I want a rig. I don't know how that's how it went. Would you say, let's do this in stereo, or do you just ask the artist what they want?
I ask them what they want to do and what they're trying to achieve, and whether we're trying to reproduce sounds from a record, or more generic about how you want to implement stuff. Or maybe they're going in the studio and they want to have their stuff organized and configured for usage that way. But more often than not, the record's done. Got to get a rig together to take on the road to duplicate the songs on the record, and those songs on the record might have certain production elements that you want to, duplicate, live. Now, yeah, they can plug in a fractal or plug in a Kemper or whatever and create it within that unit, but you're within that world. It's going to sound like those units, and I don't care what you say. A blackface deluxe in a Kemper or a Axe Effects doesn't sound like a blackface deluxe sitting on the stage, man. They just don't. They're approximations, and they do it great, and they'll do it, with preset capability and blah blah blah, where you can preset sounds, and I want this deluxe with a little more uh delay, or I want a little more EQ on the top end, or I want, sure, that's all great, that's cool, do it that way. But it's just going to be different from the real thing. So
Great. I have a couple just personal questions I want to ask that I,
yeah,
since you're here. So, and again, thank you.
sure.
Reverbs in a live guitar rig have always sort of stumped me. when if I'm rehearsing and I kick on my reverb, I always feel like my guitar disappears a little bit. But
Yeah.
then there's always been reverbs in this. And then do I do a plate? Do I do a room? Do I do a hall? So can you, and I've seen reverbs in Luke's Rack and Landau and
Yeah.
like, I'm assuming you pre-programmed a lot of the sounds on for a lot of the racks, like Huff and stuff. So some of these guys don't seem like they're effect nerds. They're just like, give me the sound, cool. And I'll
Right. Yeah. Luca, there's that way. Landau's a little more engaged in the settings and stuff. We actually, Mike and I pretty much pioneered a lot of these techniques that we're talking about here today. He was like my guinea pig years ago. And we were really stumbling through this stuff and figuring stuff out, everything from wet, dry, wet to, load boxes and loading amps rather than and using amps is preamps almost to get their dry signals before the effects. But yeah, you're talking about again, what you're saying um, is true, and that comes again down to um, combining the signal electronically versus acoustically. Um, if you were to have a wet dry system or even wet dry wet dry wet just means stereo wet surrounding a dry sound. So this way you call it. But if even if it was just wet and dry, um, you probably wouldn't hear that same. You wouldn't lose your
Mhm.
your dry sound if the wet sound was coming out of its own dedicated cabinet rather than coming out along with the dry sound in the same cabinet. And because a speaker's got to deal with a whole bunch of complex signal, then, you know, you're talking about reverbs and stuff that are decays and reflections. That's a crazy complex signal that a dumbass guitar speaker has to deal with. It's hard enough for a damn 12-inch speaker to have to deal with, a dry, overdriven sound with all its harmonics and overtones and everything that constitute a good guitar sound. You know,
Mhm.
that's complicated for that, and therefore that's why um, you hear reverb's going to sound different coming through your full range monitors that have dedicated speakers, dedicated speakers for the highs, lows, and mids and stuff in a three-way system. You
Mhm.
know, they're separated via a crossover. That's why that's done. So
Mhm.
it's almost the same, kind of idea is separating some of that complexity of that signal you're trying to shove into a guitar speaker by having it come out of separate speakers, even if both of them are, say, 12-inch speakers or something. That's fine. Actually, it's the fact that they're separated is what really matters. you
Ah,
know
yes, that totally makes sense.
yeah. So and also again another thing, I always put delays last. People tend to put reverbs last.
Right.
I'm not sure why that ever even got that way, because that's another reason. You've got an enveloping reverb sound and you've got delays that are decaying, depending upon how much feedback you have, or, and I want that feedback of that delay to be distinct and not buried in the wash of the reverbs. I put the delays last so that the decays can be more distinct. If you think about it, you're standing on a mountaintop and you're yelling, to hear an echo. You've got the big wide open sky there, but the decays are getting washed up in that big openness. And that's the same thing here if you put your delays before your reverbs. So I tend to like make it, and it's a subtle thing, you know. But and again, anything works. Whatever works for you, go for it. You know, it's like most guys plug their wah in first because it was the easiest place to plug your guitar in
Right.
on the floor. You know, well, I would put wahs a little further down the signal path when I had the ability to do so because I wanted the overdriven uh, sound of the distortions and such to be filtered by the wah rather than you're wahing the distorted signal rather than distorting the wah signal, you know.
Hmm.
So that's another one, but that again, it's subtle and you know anything goes. And the other thing too regarding signal path and stuff, it doesn't matter if there's only one thing on at a time. It doesn't matter where things are in the signal path if there's only one on at a time. You know, it's
Right.
just simple stuff like that. It's just like putting stuff into a loop system rather than daisy chaining all your pedals and stuff together. When you put it into a loop system, you're disconnecting the cables to and from the pedal as well as um, you know the pedal itself. So you're eliminating that much more complexity from your signal path. So that's why I vote for a loop system any day, no matter what it is, no matter who makes it, whatever it is. If it's done right, then you know it's a cleaner signal path than just patching through your pedals. So
Yeah,
you
and I
know,
don't know if it's a mental thing, but sometimes if I am set up with a looper and I just want my dry signal, it feels, I feel like I'm more connected. Maybe it is actually more connected by taking everything out versus just
yeah,
bypassing everything.
yeah. Yeah.
The last question I have for you, like for me, I mean, the rack tone stuff is just, I love it so much. My favorite sounding album is Toto 7.
Hmm.
Just so lush, and it's like the definitive. It feels like everything in the racks got totally perfected around that time, and
That's
everything
great because
worked
that's
out.
got my favorite Toto song on it, These Chains. That's my favorite Toto song.
Oh, that's
On the seventh one, it's got all the elements of their music in one tune. It's got Luke singing. It's got Jeff with the shuffle groove, man. That's the pretty shuffle going on, man. And it's just beautiful David Page piano, and it's just got it all, man. It's just that's the epitome of them, more so than you know, Rosanna or Africa or any of those tunes. These
thing.
chains, yeah.
Um, so for you though, aside from this, is there any like, it doesn't have to be rack tones. Is there a guitar tone that you're like, oh, this is where I go back to for home? This melts me.
Um, the one that makes my big toe shoot up in my boot is definitely I got to toot my own horn here though because it's actually um, a record that I'm looking to see if I have a record that I actually recorded, and it's Mike Landau's Live 2000 at the Baked Potato, recorded at the Baked Potato. I'm trying
Mm.
to see if I have it here. It's got the biggest, fattest, baddest guitar sound, and
Is that the
it.
one that has Worried Life Blues on it?
I think it does. Well, maybe.
It's red.
Wait,
It's sort of a silhouette of him on the cover.
Red. Yeah, yeah, yep. I'm looking. Is it? Where is that thing? Hold on a second. Let me look here.
I'll talk while you look. If
Yeah,
you
yeah,
heard
yeah.
that album, it is so ferocious. And yes,
Oh my God, yeah.
some of the biggest
Uh,
tones ever.
yeah. This one right here.
Yeah.
That one, man. That's just got the sickest sounds, and that was like I think it was like a Fender, Fenders, a Deluxe and a Super, I think, were
Oh,
what
it was
were
all
used.
Fenders.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Wow.
definitely.
So
Live 2000 for sure.
you recorded that at the Baked Potato. How on earth
I
did you
did.
do that? It's like the smallest, no room to put even
Oh,
mics.
yeah, no. Well, it was it had a I think he probably had a an effect cab too. Um I'd have to check my notes, but that was usually the setup back then. Um but bleed is your friend, man. I mean, everything kind of bled together, but it was all multi-tracked. I used Studer ADATs to record that. And uh yeah,
Studer
Studer,
ADATs?
Studer
Like,
ADATs. Yeah,
so
Studer made uh, ADATs for a
really,
while.
like
Yeah, man.
they did a better version than the Alesis.
Yeah, I know
Like,
they were like beefy and just really great, really
oh
good.
wow.
Yeah, yeah. Very rare. Um, I use those because my friend Chuck Gavoris uh, worked at Studer, so he arranged that for me. And yeah, two of them, 16 tracks. Yeah. Um,
Well, you're right. That's another one of the albums that's always loaded into my phone that I keep.
oh my God. Why You Lie. Listen to Why You Lie. It's it's sick. It's so great. And Mike mixed that and did a great job. It was just I was hoping to do a since this is the 25th year, this is a 25-year anniversary of that record.
Hmm.
We talked about possibly doing a vinyl release. I'm not sure if he still has the masters though, because of the damn fire.
Fire. Yeah.
Yeah. If in any event, he's probably got. He might have it on a hard drive that he might have got out with him, but he used to do the two tracks down to it would be tape. So I'm not sure whether that survived.
Hmm.
Um, but at least I've got a CD of it.
Yeah. And it sounds
Yeah,
great. It's
it
not one of
sounds
those.
really great. Yeah,
Yeah.
so
Doesn't
I was
need to be
happy with that.
remixed, thankfully.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bob, thank you so much. I know that this isn't the 2 minute interview that I said it
Hey,
was.
man, I can talk. Wind me up, and I just take off, man. If you got any other questions, I'm happy to answer them for you.
It's great. I think I'm going to actually make this a separate video. If you're okay with it, we'll make it just a
Oh,
conversation
fine.
with Bob
Go for it,
Bradshaw.
man.